for joining us. Today, Claire will be known to some of you. Claire, it's 8 o'clock in the morning in Chicago, where Claire is based. This is the one, I think, week when we could get this, what is it, 5 hour time difference and
Yes.
make this at all reasonable as a proposition. So, so thanks, Claire. And I know there's a little bit of
You-
life carrying on behind you as you're talking to us today. Um, and we're also delighted that Claire is going to be joining us in UCD as a visiting professor this year, and which is great because, of course, Claire is a graduate of UCD architecture, and after graduating from UCD architecture, she went on to do a master's in Yale, and from there embarked on a career in practice and in teaching in the US. She's currently professor of architecture in University of Illinois Chicago, and where she has been publishing and teaching and researching, winning many awards along the way. She's the author of a number of publications, particularly, I'll just hold up Learning from Logistics. I know it's backwards on the screen, but Learning from Logistics, How Networks Change Cities from 2016. Her forthcoming book is called Hot Farms, How Emails Grow Tomatoes. And of course, she was also a member of the team, the multidisciplinary team Annex, which curated and produced Ireland's pavilion at the well, what was supposed to be the Venice Biennale 2020 turned into the Venice Biennale 2021. And that is the subject of this book. Again, you can't see this book, but called States of Entanglement. So the pavilion itself is called Entanglement, and it's there in Venice, I think, until the end of this month, more or less, the end of November. But will be coming to Ireland next year to a couple of venues, and who knows, we may hear more about that. I'm sure we'll hear more about that in due course. But I'm really delighted that Claire is able to join us today to talk a little bit about her research, which deals, as the titles of these books and their topics would suggest, deals with questions of data, questions of logistics, and how these systems and orders, if you like, impact on the built environment at every scale, from the scale of the building, scale of the space, to the scale of the city. So what we're going to do is Claire is going to talk to us a little bit for maybe 20, 25 minutes, something like that, and then there'll be a chance for conversation. I've got questions. I'm sure many people will have questions, comments they want to make. So if you do want to comment, either just raise a hand and you can chip in, or say you'd like to say something in the chat, or put a question into the chat. The usual ways with which we're all quite familiar at this stage. But to start with, I'm going to hand over to Claire, and Claire, look forward to hearing more about what you're up to and what you've been up to.
So thank you, Hugh. Sorry, there's a lot of buttons. I have an alarm going and the mute and the video clip. I need 7 hands. Thank you. And I'm delighted to be here to talk to you all. As Hugh said, I'm an alum of the school, although albeit from quite a long time ago, I'm not even going to say. But have been sort of abroad for pretty much most of my professional career. Stayed in Dublin for a couple of years in the mid-90s, was probably the only person who left Ireland because it was just at the time when things were getting really busy in the mid-1990s. But that's over 20 years ago, so that'll give you a bit of an idea. So anyway, I'm going to go straight into it since we had, sorry about that kind of little bubble at the start. I'm going to get straight into it. I thought Hugh described the presentation as a somewhat of an introduction, so I'm just kind of going to give a big kind of an overview of my work and how I work, and the type of practice that I have, show a couple of projects, and then hopefully that'll kind of start a couple of questions in the thread or from the audience. So stop me if there's any questions or any issues with the presentation. Just very quickly in terms of the practice, I kind of like to use the term expanded practice, meaning I think that I operate as an architect maybe a little out of the traditional term, like the architect with a capital A. So I kind of run what I call a research design based practice that's at the intersection of architecture, landscape, and planning. dedicated to researching, designing, and writing about the contemporary urban environment. Focuses on a holistic vision for the integration of systems in the city. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, whether that's mobility systems, distribution, information flows, and more recently, as Hugh said, agricultural production. In other words, exploring not just the technical, but more significantly, the cultural implications of metabolic and socio-technical systems, and speculating on these as a catalyst for design. So the kind of cultural aspect of systems, I think, is very important and separates sort of system work from engineering and from maybe an arts practice. Work is design-based research, as I said, a thought process that evaluates ways in which architecture confronts the complex conditions that society faces today. This involves employing design to communicate as well as to speculate on some of the spatial transformations that are taking place around us, delivered across multiple modes: writing, editing, books, exhibitions, and design projects. And again, I'll kind of talk about a kind of sampling of those design products. So I wanted to start with this image. I think everyone should have a kind of image that kind of articulates their practice. And I've always loved this image, quite a tragic image, sorry to use, but this is the debris field after the Space Shuttle Columbia disaster in the early 2000s, when they brought the debris back to the warehouse at NASA and started to assemble the shuttle to sort of find out what went wrong. And Bruno Latour uses this image to talk about kind of network theories. And so the idea that we have of the space shuttle, you know, as this sort of romantic, iconic object going off into space, it kind of is really, when you look behind the object, this is the space shuttle. It's an assembly, it's an entanglement of fabrication, investment, research, design, production, that all merge together to produce this object that we are so kind of accustomed to seeing. And so it kind of foregrounds process and the systems behind the object that I'm kind of interested in. So just hold that thought for a moment. A similar image that I kind of love is this image of the barcode, because it kind of talks about the same thing, not as maybe dramatic. And this is a ubiquitous image graphic that you see every day. But again, this image is not, it's not iconic, it's not pictorial, it's not compositional in one way, it's full of information. And so the barcode, as you know, this has got information on sell by date, where a product was made, when it was purchased, how heavy it is, what it does, la, la, la. The idea that it is registering the backstage processes of the toothpaste or whatever it is representing, kind of preferencing the system instead of the formal object. And again, that's kind of something that's kind of interesting, and that I hope comes out in the work as I move forward. And so just a couple of the different systems that I've been looking at, as Hugh mentioned, the book is like 5 years old now, so I'm not going to talk about it that much, but I know some of you have been reading it in Hugh's seminar. Started to look at these systems that we now use every day, and we've been using a lot of them during COVID. The three at the top were the main systems that I was interested in: FedEx, which is kind of a delivery service, it's like DHL, Amazon, and Ryanair, and the logic that the three of those platforms together control the delivery of information, people, and materials. And it seemed like a good start to kind of think about logistics from the perspective of those three platforms. And so the book tries to articulate what is logistics, and more importantly, what's its significance for the built environment. And so the book is based on 5 chapters that each spins a kind of an urban story through each of these platforms to deliver some sort of understanding of how logistical systems are changing the city. So the chapters are called Time, looking at how networks are now more critical to kind of the evolution of cities. the natural resources or systems, to looking at the emergence of landscape, perhaps as a more critical design field than architecture in terms of how we deal with these systems in the city. And then the end of that, again, you know, as a designer, I think it's very important that we do some research and we do analysis, which that book I think is about, but that you also start to apply that intelligence in speculative design projects. So for me, learning from logistics, which is, you know, why the title, you know, dare I be so cheeky to kind of, it's kind of named after Learning from Las Vegas, which for me was a book that broke the mold almost 50 years ago in terms of an architectural project, and that you could start to think about architecture as a research project and then try to understand how that folds back in to your own design project. So the research methodology of the book is as important to me as the actual kind of content. And so moving quickly on, another format, another exhibition. This was an exhibition, so keeping with the logistical theme, just understanding how that might get delivered a little differently in a different medium. This was at the Seoul Biennial a couple of years ago. And I had been then interested in how logistics, we start to use all these devices and gadgets to kind of mediate between ourselves and this kind of global logistical world. And I love this image from Banham's essay in the 1960s. I mean, it's not his image, but it's in the essay, showing, you know, the kind of, the house has now been reduced to an environmental bubble with mechanical and electronic systems, and the notion that really the complete dematerialization of architecture in favor of electronic systems as a way to survive. And that sort of resonated a little bit with me as I started to look at some of the technologies that now mediate between us and this logistical world. And so I tried to kind of put made a mural of all of these devices, artifacts, spaces, again, going back to that kind of original image, the kind of network assembly, all of the actors involved in these gadgets and in how these gadgets start to connect each other and then ultimately involve us in parts of these logistical systems, whether it's online shopping, it's socializing through social media or WhatsApp or other online systems, the storage of data, which was kind of one of the first times I got involved in data, through eBay and other systems like that. And so this was a kind of a video that was running in the show. And I'm just going to stop that there because we're going to keep going. And then in another room in the space, I had kind of two rooms in this tiny little kind of Korean house. I wanted to kind of communicate certain aspects, or again, these key concepts of logistics. And these are the two rooms, sorry. And I had been interested in the kind of interior of the fulfillment center. This is an Amazon fulfillment center in Phoenix. This is quite an old one. The new ones are even larger. And, you know, the kind of vastness and like these are landscapes. They're not actually buildings, because if you look at how they're measured or how they're calibrated, they're actually calibrated in square acres. And so the idea, like, how do you communicate that? And so here's a drawing. And so I became interested in the floor systems, how they tape them out in advance of putting in the furniture. Began looking at kind of Jim Lambie's work, and then made this kind of floor installation in the space that attempted to be a kind of an infinity room, like Cosima's famous infinity rooms. Archizoom did one in 1972. And that's the kind of installation just before the opening. Again, and this is something that maybe might come up as I talk about the biennial, trying to communicate something that is not typically communicated spatially. The kind of infinity and the kind of vastness of these fulfillment centers that nobody, when you go online and you do your Amazon order, you've absolutely no clue, I don't think, of how the system works. So rendering legible what is typically hidden. And that's a kind of theme, I think, that kind of comes up again and again, and a couple of stills. And then there was some other images from a studio I did at UIC, some white papers, we call them, another video, and that was kind of all together. So now for something different, also looking at hydrological systems or other natural systems in the city. So it's not all logistical and technical systems. I wanted to show this because this was a book that I thought was a precedent for States of Entanglement. It's an atlas, and for me, States of Entanglement is also an atlas as a kind of document. This was a book from 2017 that we were involved with for 10 years. With Charles Waldheim, Danny Ibanez, and Mason White at the University of Toronto. And I'm not going to go into it in great detail, but it talks about the Great Lakes. Chicago is the major city on the Great Lakes, as you all know. And the Great Lakes are this huge, vast body of fresh water. And the book talks about the kind of, it's called A Prelude to a Plan. The book is kind of, what would you need? What sort of research or information would you need if you were to make a plan for the Great Lakes moving forward in an age of climate change and in the Anthropocene and so on? And then out of that, oddly enough, a couple of years later, there was a competition for a project on the Erie Canal, which is interesting because a canal is a post-industrial logistical system. So this became about kind of reevaluating or revitalizing a kind of obsolete logistical system. And again, I'm going to scroll through these images pretty quickly. The Erie Canal was a historic waterway that connected the Great Lakes actually to the Atlantic seaboard, built by the Irish in the 1820s. And this competition was about how to revitalize the canal towns on the Erie Canal. Now that commercial navigation on the canal is over, these canal towns are kind of suffering economically and need some more sort of initiatives. And so my project became about the canal in wintertime because the canal is dewatered between November and April. They empty the canal basically, or it's very shallow. And so the logic was it would become very easy to freeze the water, although that didn't turn out to be the case because now we don't have the winters that we used to have. And so we ended up having to kind of make a synthetic intervention into the canal that was basically a winterscape. And it was this kind of marine decking system that floats on the dewatered canal in the canal waterway, that has ice skating, pond hockey, campfires, the works. This was a phasing diagram, how it comes together and how it's sort of floated in the canal. And then some kind of renderings of the canal. And then the idea was that it would move to a different town each winter. So it's kind of like they would kind of compete for this event, and sort of that you spread the sort of the economic output of such a project across the different canal towns. And that got through to a phase 2. We got paid, which was great, to do the second phase, but ultimately didn't win. And so that brings me to Entanglement, that I'll talk about very quick. I feel kind of at odds talking about the project on my own because, as you all know, it's a group project. So I'll just kind of give a quick overview in terms of how I came to Entanglement and how my work up before this kind of fed into how we thought about the project. But of course, it's very much the brainchild of the Annex family, Donal Lally, David Capner, Alan Butler, Fiona McDermott, Sven Anderson, and myself. It was interesting in light of the earlier logistical work that I was doing, that we came to look at the data centers in Ireland, all predominantly around the M50 outside Dublin. This is Facebook in Clonee, County Meath, that I had been looking at the kind of the front end of logistics, like the delivery and the box arriving on your doorstep. And of course, what I realized is that the logistics is completely an information system, and that to make logistics work, you need an even backstage to the backstage, like a backstage to the fulfillment center, which is the data center. And of course, Amazon have a huge presence in Dublin that's only growing with their new facility in Mulhuddart. So it was kind of very interesting for me to be able to kind of recontextualize my project back into the Irish landscape. And so most of you are now all very familiar. This is Amazon and Tala. This is a map made for the book of that the M50 you see is the road, the T50 is a fiber optic cable that's just kind of offset and isomorphic with the M50, where all of these data centers cluster. And even since we've made this map, there's like, I think there's up to 100 data centers either in operation or in planning stage in total. And so the big ones with the big bubbles are the kind of big US companies, Amazon, Facebook, Google, and Microsoft. The other interesting thing geospatially, of course, is that these cables that still run across the transatlantic wash up in these extremely remote areas of the west of Ireland, Lewisburg, CLUAA. So you have these super high-speed cables where your Instagram feed is actually coming aground and being redistributed to the like continental Europe from these locations where the transatlantic cable is spliced into terrestrial networks. And so it's kind of fantastic to think of this nanosecond activity coming aground at CLUAA. And it reminds me of Neil Brenner, is an urban theorist here at University of Chicago. And he talks about planetary urbanization. And what he means by that is that, we think that urbanization is something that happens in the big cities, like that New York is urban or Dublin is urban or Chicago is urban, but actually urbanization has now extended itself to kind of every tenet of the Earth's surface. And so CLUAA, County Mayo, in his view, is just as urban, not because it's a big metropolis, but because it contributes to the processes of urbanization and makes urbanization in other areas happen. And so it's kind of an interesting theory, of course, that in his case leads to the kind of, there is now no opposition between urban and other. Everywhere is urban. If you think about that, extrapolate his theory in that way. Of course, then the kind of flip side of all of this is the kind of environmental problems, which of course was kind of, I had been sort of in blissful, let's say, ignorance in my earlier work about the kind of environmental implications of the Amazons and all the platforms of the world. And now the kind of story is, as you all know, that it has really distinct material consequences, which really became our, the way we looked at data information in Ireland globally, is the notion that the cloud is not this magic and ethereal and atmospheric space. It's actually got enormous material environmental implications, and we were going to explain that story, and we were going to explain it from the perspective of Ireland's role in data communications, because Ireland was the place where the first transatlantic cable came aground in 1858 from Newfoundland. And this fantastic image from Charles Robert Dudley, showing the cable being pulled by hand from the Great Eastern onto Valentia Island. And I know that Marlowe has been doing research on this and writes a lovely photo essay in the book that talks about the historical story to great effect. Of course, in tandem with that, well, actually not in tandem, about 40 or 50 years later, Ireland again is home to this kind of, monumental communications project when Marconi set up one of his wireless stations in Derrygimla in Clifton, the one of 3. I think he had one in Malin Head, and he also had one in Ballybunion, to kind of test radio messaging across the Atlantic again. So this legacy of technology embedding itself in the landscape is such a fantastic story. And not only the legacy of that, but the kind of contemporary version of that became very important. And so this is the pavilion in the space in Venice. It's a tower. It's made of 3 tiers of server cabinets, which is the kind of the building block of the data center. It's infilled with cables and fans and screens, and computer equipment and plants. You'll notice that the racks are singed, synthetically torched. There you see Sarah Murphy up there torching it. And that's because at some point, and I think this was kind of Donal and Alan kind of came to this fantastic kind of idea that there's such an amazing relationship between information and heat, and that the kind of, I think the sentence is, the production of heat is inextricably tied to the production of information. And if you look back, whether that's heating the copper for the early transatlantic cable, heating copper to mold the copper to extreme temperatures, to more contemporary version of looking at these Bitcoin mines, that there's so many computers in the room and it's so hot that it self-combusts the space. And then maybe from a more social end, the kind of notion of fire as a primitive form of information exchange, like literally collecting around the fire to tell stories. Or in the case of the bonfire, because there is the kind of a kind of reference between the pavilion and bonfires, as this kind of fire typology that is both a community building event, but also has a kind of dystopian side to it, kind of, you know, sort of a warning sign, which of course gets to the kind of environmental implications. But we don't kind of say it up front. The bonfire reference is just a kind of artful way of kind of communicating that. So that's the kind of story behind the kind of form of the pavilion. The plants, of course, make reference to the material that this plant from, I can never remember if it's from Malaysia or Indonesia. That's 22 minutes. Sorry, I'm finishing up now. That was farmed almost to extinction as an insulator to the original cables. Permographic cameras were used, put on a drone to photograph these data centers. On the M50, again, thermographic cameras communicate heat is their register. We used slate as a kind of reference to the Valentia Island on the seats that were etched with different cable trajectories and inset with actual cable sections. And then sort of this is all comes together as this performance piece. The pavilion, try not to talk over the the pavilion is on a timed performance when all of these components that I just talked about come in and out in a kind of sequence that's loosely mimicked on the states of 4 states of fire: incipient, inferno, development, and decay. I have those in the wrong order, sorry. And it's kind of controlled. Sven Anderson, like, you know, was controlling this sequence, like in Entanglement. That in addition, there's a server in the structure that's like a library of over 10 million words that was fed into the server, and it outputs the text almost like a machine learning, which of course the original cable, the Morse code, was kind of like a form of machine learning. And so the kind of the pavilion has a kind of is a machine as well. Oh, sorry. One again. And then just to end very quickly, just kind of bringing you up, like, you know, there's now a lot of talk about the data industry in Ireland at the moment in terms of the heat exhaust from these data centers that's been used as heating in Tala or Wilby. to many of the large companies entering into energy partnerships to build renewable farms, wind farms in the west of Ireland. And in the book, just in terms of then spinning it back to the kind of design project or the projective project, in my case, in the book, starting to look at sort of rural digital environments, speculative, that combines, like prototypes, that combines data, energy, office, living into kind of new, I don't know what we post-COVID tech rural commune, I suppose is the best way of describing it, where you start to think about the systems holistically. So the wind farm makes the energy, the data makes the heat that runs the facility that supports a swimming pool. You have carbon capture machines cleaning the air. You have technology, you know, on the farm, and these kind of images where you have kind of conference center and farm sort of juxtaposed each other. The capabilities maybe of thinking about, if you think about these systems differently, you can start to curate new adjacencies that can be kind of quite radical or actually quite plausible moving forward. And so my contribution to the book offers up 3 of these sort of scenarios: a project for the M50, a project for County Mayo, and a super data center housing out on the docks in Dublin Bay. And that's all in the book, which will be unveiled on December 1st, Wednesday, December 1st, during Dublin Book Fair. We're going to have a book launch, and so that'll be an opportunity to talk about the book then. That's really the end. I'm just after, you know, after I'm doing, Hugh just mentioned a project about agriculture. I got sort of money from the SOM Research Foundation last year and ran a studio on trying to align the exhaust from data storage centers to new intensive greenhouse farming that would also alleviate the greenhouse gas emissions from livestock farming and industry. So you would flip, rezone agricultural land because now we could support ourselves with these intensive greenhouse farming. This is a Tim Hagen image from the Netherlands. And then that was just, I was just really quickly showing you an output of that research, because I teach, and that's an important part of my practice, a student designing an underwater data farm and seaweed farm in CLUAA, that again has a kind of holistic, like looks at being circular, but not in a kind of sustainable way, in a kind of very artful way and in a very radical way, I hope. And so this is the kind of project. The data centers are under these platforms. Seaweed and kelp is grown. The seaweed is dried by the heat from the data center. And so there's a great movie of that I'm not going to show, that you can go online. And then the last project I just did myself, which is coming up in an issue of New Geographies, looks at a wireless room in Killala on the line of this transatlantic cable, the AEC cable. Again, you know, it's kind of like a live visitor's book, I call it. And there's also one in Long Island, which is the terminus on the western side. But again, kind of a folly. But again, sort of trying to bring home this logic that the world we live in has consequences. And when you look at your phone, there's something happening, and that has geospatial implications and geospatial reality. And that's it.
Thank you, Claire, for an incredibly lucid and engaging half hour, and maybe less than, just under half an hour, but it was really
good.
I mean, just great to see the range, just the range of work, but also the sort of coherence of it in terms of your overall set of interests. And I guess summed up there at the end where you're talking about the sort of geospatial consequences of all of these, well, of everything, I suppose, that we of all of our collective and individual activities. So there's a huge amount there, and I have lots of questions or just maybe things to reflect on a little bit. But please, again, just to invite anybody who does have a question or a comment or wants to talk with Claire a bit more, if you just either raise your hand or maybe indicate in the chat something you'd like to talk about, we can do that. One thing I might just to start off with, Claire, is just thinking about um, the how you might like people to respond to the work. I'm thinking particularly the Venice work, but also a lot of your other work, in the sense that it could be. I was thinking of that for some reason, that song that comes up in The Big Lebowski. It came into my mind. I just checked in to see what condition my condition is in, and there's a feeling that a lot of the time that all we can do is check in to see the condition of the condition. That this is the current contemporary condition. Let's just immerse ourselves in it, or let's just wallow in its kind of multifaceted, interdependent, intertwined, global, um, you know what I mean, impact. And one wonders, I suppose, whether in checking in to understand the condition we're in, you feel as a result more knowledgeable, but maybe less powerful or less enabled or overwhelmed, or do you know what I mean? Like, I mean, that's this whole thing of the black box, of like wanting to kind of open up the black box and show, actually, look, here's how it all connects. Here's the spatial consequence of the thing that you're holding in your hand. What's the next step for people from there? Is it just that knowledge is power, that it's better to know these things, or how do you?
That's a really good question. I have to think about that. I mean, you could say, I mean, for me, there has to be a disciplinary project in it. I mean, it's not like it's not an activist practice. At least my project is not, you know what I mean, where I have some responsibility to communicate the kind of problems or opportunities, whatever way you want to look at it, of these systems to the public. And in a way, you could almost say that some of that narrative is a kind of alibi. It's a conceit, or it's just an alibi for me to be able to kind of do my thing. So, that's why for me, the projective part of the research is so critical, because if you don't have that, then it's just, you're a journalist, really. You're kind of indexing the problem. You're right. And checking in and communicating that problem. So for me, the kind of projections are critical. And that's where I see the kind of disciplinary project, looking for ways to recombine things that maybe already exist, or looking for, new adjacencies, or just new ways to kind of put those things together that sometimes might be, sort of placed under the umbrella of circular economy and sustainability. And I do have some, again, it's back, I'm not an activist practice. I mean, we're throwing those words around without kind of really, kind of quite gratuitously. But the other thing that I think, again, within the projective work, and I do say this in the book, and I do believe this, I think that design has a power to communicate in the way other disciplines don't. And if we use that, capability to communicate some of these things, again, not in an indexical way, but it has to be communicated in an artful and in a very provocative way, then I think we do have some sort of agency, believe it or not, in the environmental crisis, or even, not necessarily designing our way out of it in a kind of problem solving sense, but revealing the possibilities or the benefits that might emerge from the kind of doom and gloom that we see at the moment.
Oh,
So I don't know if that completely answers your question, but
It does.
and I don't have a kind of a fully informed answer. But I think there's quite a few people out there now, like, I'm not the only person, doing this, kind of a cohort of thinkers. And I think it's finding its place, as a form of practice, as opposed to a form of activism or environmental critique or whatever.
But just to, I mean, that answers the question really well, Claire. But I mean, and by if you like, laying the emphasis on this, the projective power of design, and I guess maybe the question coming from that would be, I mean, to put it at its dumbest, who is the client, or if one is then wanting to make, to actualize those projects, which are able,
Yeah.
let's say, that necessitate a kind of system thinking where you're pulling together different actors, different forces, different systems that don't necessarily sit in the same room with each other, that don't talk to each other. Maybe how complex is that? I'm conscious. You know what I mean? That like the next stage beyond the communication of the possibility would be the actualization of it, presumably. How would one begin to take something like some of the projects you're putting forward in the book? The
Well, yeah, I mean, the projects are completely naive, and I'm, yeah, kind of run an academic practice. I mean, but I think
but I mean, I don't. Well, I wouldn't think that they're naive, but that
I
because.
think they are, yeah.
But I mean, well, no, but they are proposals for an order of things, if you like, and there is an order of things at the moment that doesn't seem terribly sensible or thought through or sustainable, and maybe not even efficient or economic or socially beneficial. So there's all kinds of problems with the way of the current scheme of things. So the idea of proposing, a better one doesn't seem naive. It maybe seems urgent. So
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's just maybe now that's just emerging. I mean, even since we unveiled the pavilion, I mean, the amount of, especially, it's funny that we're having the conversation today with the Glasgow conference, like suddenly the world has really kind of opened up to, especially in Ireland, the kind of data situation. And so maybe the kind of finding a client, or maybe finding research funding for the design fields, you know what I mean, at the policy level, I think is kind of critical, because nobody really knows what to do. And so there's a kind of opportunity, I think, there. And not to kind of reclaim the heavy hand of the architect, but I mean, years ago, I think architects were far more involved. I mean, if you look at look at crises in previous eras, like post World War II. I mean, modernism, I mean, the modern movement came out of, well, actually World War I. That moments of crises have been very opportunistic for the discipline. You know what I mean? So I think, maybe the environmental question is our moment of crisis, but it's really just emerging now where design might find itself in that, as opposed to the way it found itself after World War I or after World War II. I think it's going to be a different role. But yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of at policy level, Hugh, now too, that maybe politicians or the people who run these data centers maybe have to be more kind of open-minded about how things move forward, and how these integrate themselves
yeah,
into the landscape. But it's complex. There's a lot of entanglements, that's the kind of, which I didn't talk about the word entanglement, but that's kind of
I think it was.
why the pavilion is called that, is that, and again, that's a very famous term that's been deployed in other disciplines, but the notion that it's very, you can't remove any one aspect and kind of look at it in isolation. It's just so full of contradictions and oppositions, and it's very complex.
And one of the things, I mean, it is, I would say, remarkably prescient. I guess probably 2019 when you were proposing that, and I guess people knew about data centers, but not to the extent that they do now. Interestingly, even over the course of the last 24 months, I think the narrative, and particularly the narrative about them as the energy consumers par excellence, has really come up in a way that it probably wasn't before. So it was really very far-sighted of you guys to kind of settle on that topic, but also your insistence on the idea that that Ireland is very much at the core of this. I mean, is it? Do you think that Ireland is that's a sort of an exceptional condition, or that it's, let's say, a very typical, an archetypal condition, let's say? Because Ireland does have that specific position, edge of Europe,
Yeah.
even in terms of time zones, halfway between the two big markets in Asia and then the big West Coast, the US, English speaking, da 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 da. There's all these accidents of geography
Yeah.
and culture that seem to position it ideally as this kind of nexus point. Is that?
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, I wouldn't say it's unique though, at the same time. I mean, it's funny that I think Amsterdam also claims itself to be the data center of Europe, and London and Paris used to be, and now Madrid is kind of expanding its IT infrastructure. So I really don't know, to be honest. So I don't think Dublin is unique. It might be unique in terms of the investment from the super big IT companies like Facebook and Amazon. But those cables, like Google, there's even a higher speed cable. Is it the Maria cable? Goes from Virginia to Bilbao in Spain. Again, using its kind of edge of Europe local geography. So it's happening in other areas. So I don't think it's unique to Ireland, but I suppose what is unique to Ireland is that that the story has been going for 150 years. Do you know what I mean? It's been a very like in fits and starts. So and it's a kind of a colonial project. It was a colonial project in 1858 because, of course, the British were, used Ireland as the kind of the host or the landing, and now it's a kind of corporate colonization. And so Ireland has been the kind of subject to different colonial regimes. And maybe that's unique in the way some of the other European countries maybe had more agency in the decision making about the technology.
And just again, if people have questions or comments for Claire, do feel free to put them in the chat, or just to come off mute and chip in by all means. Claire, I'm conscious of time. We might take about 5 or 10 minutes more, if that's okay.
That's fine. That's fine. I'm quiet house now, so no trouble.
One thing I was wondering as well is because there's definitely there's a sort of I would want to say there's a sort of strain of techno optimism, if I can put it like that, that through a number of the references that you were showing in the talk, the Francois Dallerget and Rainer Banham, the Super Studio to an extent. Like I would have think that the Rochester Canal project, I was thinking of Archigram, the idea of the moving, the sort of device that moves from place to place. So, and I was wondering whether that's something that you would had an idea is not wrong, but maybe see that there's a continuity with that kind of work, and then whether. And so there might be a feeling like that with your projects, you're trying to say, look, let's try to understand these systems and then see if there's other ways in which we might harness, configure, connect them, entangle them, to produce, better outcomes. Do you ever think maybe ultimately these systems are never going to be acquiesced to our control? Do you know what I mean? Or that they're actually, we need to maybe scale back from them, or that there's a future in which they're less prevalent, less dominant, less all pervasive. Sorry, that's I don't even know if that's a question. It's just a thought.
Yeah,
Whether,
no, sorry.
and maybe as a little follow on, just whether in the work for the pavilion might actually have slightly shifted that thinking.
Well, certainly, I would say, like David and Donal and even Alan are completely convinced that the machine will take over. And so the kind of post-human side of the data center, and I know Donal has been talked about his research. I mean, they're fully committed to that as a kind of future outcome. And it's and they're really good at talking about that. And that's kind of how that AI system in the pavilion was a kind of homage to that way of thinking. I probably wouldn't go so far as they do in terms of the machine taking over, but I certainly believe we are so embedded in technological systems. I mean, this is just the latest stage of 500 years of communication advancements. So you can't really isolate data systems from capitalism and from, sort of, ever since maybe the Renaissance, you know what I mean, or the Enlightenment. It's just the latest stage in our evolution and so I think we're going to suddenly step out and I mean, I do think there might be some more awareness moving forward in terms of our contribution and how we're involved. But I mean, that's why I think the pandemic really amplified, or like if we were like just on the edge of the kind of digital era 18 months ago, I think that COVID just like threw us right into the deep end, and we swam. So but the reference to the super studio, it's kind of interesting that you pick up on that, and that's a very interesting discussion, because that's kind of bringing it back to a disciplinary, how that kind of the radicals of the kind of 60s and early 70s, I think that that's a great era too, because they were looking at early computational systems or electronics, like fax machines, and I mean, stuff that we kind of laugh about now, and were really just brilliant the way they could project that, and so not nearly as smart or as artistic as those groups that you mentioned, but still, yeah, that would be a kind of a good model for a kind of systems project that is projected in the discipline of architecture.
And in doing that, Claire, just maybe this is a final question. I don't think everyone. Maybe I'm just asking all the questions that everybody wants to ask, but just
very good questions.
um, the who do we work with? I suppose is the question, because that strikes me as a project that entails working across scales, working across fields of knowledge. Is it about architecture shifting the way that we learn and that we teach, the way we practice, or is it also about working differently with different disciplines?
I actually don't think it changes much in terms of how we teach, because I mean, I'm in the architect as the generalist camp, and that's what we learn, that's what we teach. It's just like, we're teaching the architect, a little bit about mechanical engineering, a little bit of electricity, a little bit about carpentry, a little bit about structure, blah, blah, because you need to coordinate. You're never going to be an expert in any of those things, but you need to know a little bit about each one of them to be able to coordinate a project. And so I just see this version of the architect is equally the generalist. It's just instead of cabinetry and mechanical, where our range is just a different set of systems, maybe a different, more environmental systems. And so maybe that just means you expand a little bit the kind of toolkit, but fundamentally it's the architect, what architects do well is to be able to oversee and coordinate and look across as a way to feed into something, so they look across the parts with the vision of a whole. And I don't think this project is any different. It's just taking that idea to the kind of next scale.
But also maybe putting it more at the forefront of the way that we understand how we operate. I mean, it strikes me that the famous image you began with, the Latour's image of the space shuttle spread out, the network. I mean, it's not the space shuttle that flies; it's the space shuttle that's forensically examined after it fails, if you know what I mean. So that our typical images of what we produce or work is the complete synthesized object stroke. And it strikes me that a lot of what you're talking about is suggesting that the emphasis shift to that field, that network. They understand that in a way that activity has to become more central in our ways of practicing.
Exactly, or recognition that the perfect object or the icon comes out of all of that other stuff. It's not, I mean, I still love the icon, but I don't want to fetishize the icon as this singularity, because that's a myth. Yeah, you know what I mean.
No, well, look, Claire. I mean, it's great that your book is going to be launched exactly. It sounds like exactly 1 month from today. You're going to be here, 1st of December. Not
Hopefully, yeah, all going well.
yeah,
Things change every day, but
that's
hopefully we'll be able to have now with the new public assembly.
yeah.
Numbers or limitations have been reduced, so hopefully that we'll be able to get 40 people into Temple Bar Gallery on December 1st.
That's great, and that book will be. I think it's already available, is it? But
It's already available. Yeah.
it's published by Actar, and but that launch as part of the Dublin Art Book Fair, and then I think, Claire, you're also going to be able to join us hopefully out in UCD when
On
you're.
the 2nd, yeah, hopefully that would be great.
But in the meantime, thank you so much. That was really, really,
And me.
really exciting. And despite the sort of slightly, maybe, feeling of powerlessness we might get, I don't think so. Actually, I think actually it's always good to understand more about the systems that we're working with, and to sort of hear intelligent and potent ways of trying to work with those and turn them in new directions. I think it's fantastically interesting work. So thank you for sharing it with us.
Thank you for the questions. They were very, very nice. I enjoyed those questions.
And if there's a few thanks there in the chat, you can read them there.
Okay.
That's from Nazreen. Great.
Hey, Alan Mee, how are you? A long time.
Yeah, and Gary Miley from WIT was here as well. So yeah, and we're going to record. This is being recorded, Claire, so we'll put it up.
Okay.
I know a lot of people are going to catch up after the fact because we're in the middle of a busy teaching week, and but it's great, and thank you for taking the time at the beginning of your week, right at the beginning of your week, to do this. Thank you
Not
for
at all. Good start.
coming to us across that transatlantic underwater cable, um, direct and live this lunchtime. Thanks, everyone. I should mention that our next talk, I think, is on Wednesday, November 3rd. That's Chin Konzero Chazanguza, who's going to talk to us about his work in the African village in Zimbabwe. Olivia, I hope I had that pronunciation reasonably right. And that's at 1 o'clock on Wednesday. Details on that will follow. And then we have another couple of sessions next week. And Cara has just put the links for the Instagram channel and the Twitter account up as well, so you can follow us there, please. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to stay on for a minute, Claire, if you want, just to